What happened to AAA post-COVID and what's going on with indie gaming in the US, plus everything you need to know about upcoming story-driven Metroidvania, Dewborne Dawn. Let's talk about that.
When I look at the industry, right, 2023, it was this interesting two sides of the same coin, where AAA was this massive industry. They were pumping out all these incredible games. We had Tears of the Kingdom, Baldur's Gate 3, Jedi Survivor, the list goes on and on. There were all these really, really impactful games that were bigger than they've ever been, and they were more successful than a lot of other titles before them have ever been, which for AAA is this really, really high standard. But then all of a sudden, with that high standard, you also had games like, Redfall, Gollum, Forspoken, which I will admit, I have not actually played any of these games. I have seen clips of them. I have heard people say that they were not good. And just looking at the graphics for Gollum, in my opinion, they were very cringy, especially for a AAA game, which was confusing.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's like huge budgets, huge teams, granted, very high standards because it's AAA. But what, in your opinion, makes a good game, a good AAA game in this day and age? And are people's expectations too high nowadays? Is that what it is? What
I actually don't think that it's people's expectations. What I think happened is just a very unique period in time. A lot of these games, from my research, started their development or were very early in their development when COVID hit. And I think a lot of these studios had to really change how the workload was handling. I know for Redfall, there was a lot of complete restructuring of their staff departments. I think it separated these studios. Like, we saw what studios were able to kind of weather the storm. And some even came out stronger, which is why I think we have these strong products like Tears of the Kingdom and stuff. These developers were able to kind of take this hardship and kind of allow themselves to restructure in a better way than they even were before. Companies like Arcane, there was a lot of people getting fired. There's a lot of teams that they had no idea what to do with. I think they didn't have a clear direction. They didn't have a clear plan. And so we saw this kind of attrition happen and this eventual lack of staff. So I think COVID, it either made dev teams stronger because it gave them a reason to restructure when they already needed to restructure, or it completely derailed them and they didn't have kind of the necessary skills to kind of weather that storm.
I think AAA is very, very much on this odd trajectory where, like, I don't know what it's gonna look like in the next 5 years, right? I don't know what team sizes are gonna look like, all these acquisitions, right? I mean, games are massive nowadays, and they're not just like release and done anymore. It's like release and then keep building it and keep putting content into it. And it's this interesting space of what is a AAA studio gonna look like in 5 years from now, right?
And to go back with what you said, I do think that players are starting to expect
a lot,
potentially too much. At the same time, it's kind of sad too, because indie devs can never reach kind of some of the like visual fidelity and other stuff that AAAs can reach.
True.
But it's starting to create this big divide where you have people who will only touch AAA games or people who will only touch indies, which is very interesting.
Another part of that, right? I mean, AAA, I think it's gotten this weird stigma lately where games have gotten so large. I think a lot of times players will put on these rose-colored glasses where they're like, well, every game should be like this, right? Every game should have everything. And if it doesn't have everything, or if it has everything and it doesn't do it well, it only does like one or two things well, then that's where it becomes a problem. Like, I've heard people say that about Jedi Fallen Order and Jedi Survivor, that they were great games, but they were too linear, right? They didn't deliver enough content and enough, exploration and engagement for players. And you have to think, like, that's not what that game is, right? There's different genres, there's different things. And it's just shifting that mentality. And maybe that's a conversation that players and devs need to kind of have.
It's actually sad. I mean, just talking about that specific comment, for some reason, people have developed a hatred towards like these linear games, when linear games sometimes tell the best stories because of their linearity. And it's very sad because I love a good story-rich game, and it seems like studios are starting to get really scared of developing these linear story-rich games because
they can't, they don't get the returns anymore. That's the
Yeah,
problem.
yeah, it's very sad.
That's the problem. And that's why games as a service was so popular, such an exciting idea, because it was the opportunity to make something and then continue to make profits off of it as a AAA studio. At the end of the day, that's the problem with AAA. And I can't say it's the problem, because they're huge studios, they have huge costs to the games they're making, and they employ so many people. Like, at the end of the day, it has to be about money, right? Like, people always say that with AAA. They're like, it's only about the money. It's like, well, fuck yeah, it's about the money, because they're making like $1 million games, right? They have to make that back or they go out of business. So
there's just a lot of red tape and bureaucracy kind of in that system now.
Yeah. Well, it's in everything, right? I mean, you can't you can't get away from that anymore. It's even an indie nowadays, man. Like, it's part of that.
If you're an indie, unless you're a solo developer, you pretty much have to get a publisher. Getting a publisher brings so much of that red tape, because we're trying to get a publisher. It was like one of our main reasons for having the Kickstarter is so we can raise enough funds to kind of get a prototype out to then secure a publishing contract. And I've had a lot of talks with publishers, and there's a lot of predators out there in terms of like publishers that are really trying to take advantage of you. So
I've heard publishers say that a lot of times the standards are so high and the expectations are so high because they have to protect themselves as well. And it's that weird, like, gray area where it's like, where's the etiquette for developers? Where's the etiquette for publishers? Where should the expectations be? What's fair? What's not fair? And there aren't any real answers, right? I mean, it's just kind of feeling your way through it and trusting the relationships with the publishers that have a reputation, right? It's not easy. It's not easy. There are good publishers out there, though. I mean, there are, just like there are great devs.
And I've talked to a couple. In fact, I'm in discussions with a couple right now that seem very promising, and they seem like they actually really care about helping the developers. So.
Which is awesome.
Yeah.
But I mean, down that same track, right? On the prep call, we had talked about indie gaming in the US versus the rest of the world, right?
Yes.
And it's an interesting topic. It's one I've never dived into. The thought process of how indie games are perceived and supported in Asia and Europe versus the US.
The thing is, the US has probably the biggest market for indie games. For example, like if you hold a Kickstarter and you're shipping to someone that donated from the US, Kickstarter makes it a lot easier because they know that a lot of their audience is going to be from the US. And so the audience is huge here, but for some reason, the government, the economic structure does not care, and like actively is sometimes it seems to be against kind of the indie gaming scene. For example, I have teammates from Europe, as I said, and they work for other studios there as well. I'm constantly hearing stories about government helping to provide them with loans, giving grants to them, a ton of just conferences that we don't have access to. And so it's just very sad. But what's crazy is AAA studios get all this. If you're a AAA studio in the US, you're living pretty, man. You get so much support.
Yeah. In the US, I think the mentality is different, right? Because I don't disagree with you. And it's something that I had never thought about until you brought it up on our call. And I don't hear from a lot of American indie teams, right? I hear a bunch of, South America is very, very big in the indie gaming scene.
Especially Brazil. Brazil is massive.
Yeah. And like you said, Europe, Asia, they have a lot of support and they have a lot of things in place to help these teams get off the ground and stay on the right trajectory moving forward. The US doesn't have that. And I almost wonder if it's like, you always hear like the hustle mentality in the US, you got to just, you make it and then you can kind of scale up from there. Do you think, because I have talked to a couple American indie developers who have, their first game was almost, I'm not going to say it's like a school project, but it was almost like a leap off point for them to get into AAA, right? So it's just, it's not a career. It's something to get them to their career, right? So they look at it differently.
Yeah, and actually, that's a very good point. In this industry, the U.S. actively tries to push you to work for AAA instead of trying to go your own way.
But I mean, so shifting gears, right? We're going from macro to micro. We're talking about your game now, right? Funding is a big deal. We already kind of talked about that. So you had a successful Kickstarter that just finished up. Talk to me about how a successful Kickstarter works. How do you get from A to B, and how do you reach the goals that you want to reach?
Really go hard on budgeting to know exactly how much you need. We started preparing the Kickstarter page probably back. It released in November, but we started preparing it in around like July, August time. So if anyone's ever planning on running a Kickstarter, you generally want months in advance to just start setting up the page, because visual aesthetics are everything to a Kickstarter. How the page looks, how pretty things look, how nice a trailer looks. This is everything. So give yourself ample time for like 4 to 6 months. I also contacted a bunch of like big name artists, like very popular artists, and said, hey, you know, if I pay you this amount, would you create some art of our game or the characters from our game, and like post that art with like a link to the Kickstarter saying, hey, these characters from this game. And I actually got a lot of positive reception on that, and a lot of artists were willing to do that, and I think that helped a lot too. You know, for those out there who are trying to run a Kickstarter, if you're in the middle of a Kickstarter and it seems like things might be gripped, just don't give up. Anything can happen. Obviously you don't want to get into a situation where it's looking like panic mode. If you do your due diligence, you probably won't have to, but you know, don't give up until the very end.
As I looked at your Steam page, I saw hand drawn, right? When you say hand drawn, I'm thinking you're just drawing on the page, you know, every single scene, you know, it's just all slowly coming together. So when you say there's a hand drawn game, like walk me through what that means as an indie developer.
Every single character, every single piece of art in the environment, every piece of every asset is drawn by hand, either in Krita or in Photoshop. You know, it's hand painted. We're not using any like automation software to like create each scene or each rooms. We're literally, you know, painting what we need and then kind of placing them around the scene, kind of like a puzzle. All, you know, the special effects are hand painted. So each sprite is drawn. There's no like skeleton set up that kind of automate the animation. You know, it's a balance. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of money. But I think in the end, it looks really nice. And I think people see that visual fidelity. The newer versions of Unity have very cool methods to do some dynamic lighting and ways to organize the project in ways that I like. I like how Unity handles kind of pathfinding mechanics. There are stuff I like. The worst thing, though, oh my gosh, the animation framework in Unity is such a pain to work with. I don't know who developed the framework for the animation framework, but you have to go through so many hoops just to get what you want, man.
But when you look at this game right now, right? So you've been making it for a while. Give me the elevator pitch for it. Talk to me about the gameplay mechanics. Talk to me about what people should expect, the storyline, all that good stuff that is going to be on the way when Dewborne Dawn finally does release.
So Dewborne Dawn takes place in a world called Ephamore, and the setting of the game takes place in a region called the Final Bastion, and the reason why it's called the Final Bastion is because previous to when the game takes place, there was a world-ending plague called the Spirit Blight. And so the gods of this world banded together to try to stop this mysterious Spirit Blight, but they found that even they themselves were mostly powerless against it. So one of the gods created this land called the Final Bastion that would be able to be separate from the land that the Spirit Blight is infesting. While another one of the gods, in kind of his dying breath, creates Dew, and that's the main character of the game is Dew. Your role in the game is to protect this Final Bastion and find a way to destroy the Spirit Blight and restore the dying world. And in this story, you meet a lot of colorful characters, these survivors in this land, these refugees trying to make by. Your purpose is to ally up with them, have them join your cause, but that's pretty much the setting. As for the gameplay, it's pretty much a tag team beat 'em up game is how I would explain it.
Okay.
So you're recruiting party members, and combat itself is very. If you've ever played a beat 'em up game, you know it's semi combo heavy. You're launching enemies up in the air, multi-hitting them, and maybe smashing them back down, bouncing them off the ground. You're calling your teammates in to kind of help. Furthermore, very much inspired by Sekiro, there's like a poise system in our game, kind of a stamina system where you can break the poise / stamina of an enemy and kind of unlock very flashy, kind of animated one-hit kills. We're trying to make the world very, very alive, very fleshed out, have the characters themselves feel very real and animated and colorful. You mentioned you saw the game on Steam, so we're trying to make those visual aesthetics kind of match that. We hope that it ends up just being not only a fun adventure, but a deeply rewarding emotional experience as you see the conflicts of all these different characters kind of come into play and how they get resolved and what tragedies might befall everyone, you know. So we want it to be a very narrative and emotional experience.